let's get this show, let's get this party started. It's 7 o'clock and time to rock.
What time you got?
7 o'clock?
You got 7? Okay.
Gavel, use the gavel.
All right.
All right.
Okay. I'll call to order the November 21st, 2022 Planning Commission meeting to order. The first thing on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the October meeting. Does anybody have any comments on the minutes or care to make a motion to approve those minutes?
Motion to approve.
Motion. And seconded as corrected by, I believe in advance, by you, Kent.
Yes, it's just that Chris was
Yep.
actually here in person, so. Okay, we've got a motion and a second to approve the October 17th minutes. All in favor of that motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that motion carries. Then we have a time for public comment is for anything that is not on the agenda. We can schedule up to 5 minutes for that. Is there nobody in the audience, but does anybody have anything they want to bring up that's not on the agenda tonight?
There's public on Zoom, but I don't know if they have a comment.
Okay. Any public items that need to be brought up that aren't on the agenda tonight?
Nope, not for me.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to the approval of the agenda then. Anyone care to?
Motion to approve.
Okay,
Second.
okay. Bob and Jeff made the motion. All in favor of approving the agenda for tonight, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that motion carries.
No, well, but
All right.
Moving right along.
So next thing on the agenda is appointment of a nominating committee, which is the Planning Commission's bylaws state that we have a nominating committee to make us select officers, the chair and the vice chair for next year, and make suggestion that the I guess it could be our November, December meeting, or January if it need be. Chris asked me to go ahead and make an appointment of a committee tonight, and I am asking Bob and Jeff if they will agree to be on the nominating committee and bring to us a slate of officers at our next meeting.
okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so that appointment is then made. Residential zoning update. Do you want to go with that, Mark?
Yeah, so the last time the Planning Commission discussed updating the residential zoning districts was back in June of this year. And I don't know if the Planning Commission recalls, but at that time, you had looked at a rendering of a property east of the bypass that basically showed 50% of the units being attached dwellings and the other 50% being detached dwellings. So you had asked staff to go back and look at ways of trying to take that rendering, so to speak, and put it into ordinance language and perhaps come up with a zoning approach to accomplishing that. So what we did is after talking about it at the staff level a little bit, not knowing where you might want to apply these regulations in the future, we felt it would probably be easiest to come up with an overlay district rather than a separate zoning district altogether. And so that was what was provided in your agenda this evening. Todd came up with the title, because I need to make sure I give him credit for the Residential Enhanced Density Overlay District, also known as REDO. What we did here, so Section A is just the intent, but Section B is really where we get into explaining how we would allow these attached units to be permitted on larger properties within this overlay district. So we put it at 10 acres. I think 10 acre lots or larger was what we established this as, because that was more or less what I think the Planning Commission discussed. And I did include a map that shows some of these vacant R1 zoned properties in the growth boundary that has been previously discussed. And you can see some of those are quite large. So it might be a number that the Planning Commission's happy with. I don't know. You may want to make it smaller than 10 acres. I think that's a discussion at some point that needs to be had of where you would want to see these regulations apply. But nonetheless, we put together, 1 through 5 there that explains where these would be permitted at, the maximum density, the limitation on how many there can be within any particular project, also setbacks, and trying to ensure that we don't have entire streets where they're all located. I think from what the commission had said the last time we talked about this back in June, you really liked having them scattered throughout and not all concentrated in one part of the development. So that was what number 4 was there, was to make sure we don't have any block face where both sides of the street is just all attached units, but you could have a mixture. And then the last one, number 5, is something we had shown on these renderings before, but not having attached units within 100 feet. Doesn't mean you can't have them on a parcel that's next to another existing R1 development, but the physical units themselves would have to be at least 100 feet away, just to provide somewhat of a buffer to existing neighborhoods. Landscaping standards, we did not have anything really fully baked on that yet. That's something that wasn't discussed, and I know right now Amy's been working with the Shade Tree Committee to try to get some input on how we should go about requiring plantings, knowing that some of our corridor overlay requirements are a bit extreme, and I think one of them referred to it as a reforestation buffer rather than a landscape buffer. And then the last thing on D was, again, something that the commission had expressed an interest in, was requiring better bicycle pedestrian facilities in these developments. So having at least a sidewalk on one side of all streets, and then on both sides if there's higher density being proposed on that street, and then a shared use path along any arterial street frontage for these properties, if they do indeed abut them. So it ultimately would come down to where this overlay would apply. As was also noted in the agenda, if you're agreeable to moving forward with the concept of an overlay district to try to increase density in certain areas within the R1 zone, I think staff would be interested in trying to see if there's a way of taking our existing R2 and R3 districts and consolidating them into one district. Just for simplification purposes, we currently have an R2 and an R3, but Todd and I were discussing it at length, and we think if we were to actually map out the uses and the densities that exist, probably the ones that are in R3 would be fine under our current R2 standards. So there may not be a benefit to having both of those districts where there's no real difference in what's permitted overall. So just something we would be looking into and bringing back to you in the future. But tonight, I think we're primarily looking for feedback on the overlay, and if you feel this is a good approach to move forward, and how you'd like to go about discussing where you'd want to permit this if it's something you want to do.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll ask for comments on first of all, whether or not you agree with the philosophy of doing this as an overlay district rather than as a standalone rezoning type of a parcel, if everyone agrees to that or not. And also, I think probably, just talk about maybe some of the suggestions for the regulations themselves. And then I think we should definitely talk about of these, what is this, about a dozen properties or 11 properties we're talking about here. Which ones do we think should be within this, should apply to this new zoning district? I think we should talk about all this. So I'll open it up to comments on any of those matters for whoever wants to start.
I guess the question is the rationale behind the overlay district. I'll pick up on your question. What was the rationale? Did I miss that from Todd or Mark on moving to overlay as opposed to standalone?
I probably didn't go into that in depth. I think that the benefit to using an overlay district is it gives the township a little more flexibility in deciding where you want to apply it, because the base zoning of the property would remain as R1. By using an overlay district, you have a little more flexibility in not necessarily applying it to large swaths of land. It wouldn't necessarily require changes in comprehensive planning, things like that, to say this is an area where we want higher density residential in an R2 or R3 sense, because you're really just allowing a little more than what R1 currently would allow. So I think it just makes it it makes it easier there. And Todd may have a comment as well, looks like.
Paul?
Yeah, one of the things that went into our discussions is that through the years, we've done a number of different surveys of residents about, what they wanted to see in different zoning districts. And invariably, in every survey that was done, the R1 zoning district comment, the number one R1 zoning district comment was, keep R1, R1. We don't want to see a bunch of exotic stuff. We don't want to see multifamily. We don't want to see a bunch of stuff in R1. So by proposing an overlay district rather than just changing the regulations in R1 so that it would apply to all of R1, we think we're able to provide the flexibility that we've been talking about without having any major effects on existing neighborhoods that things just couldn't redevelop as something other than R1 in those neighborhoods.
So this will affect redevelopment. Is that your primary reason behind this?
Yeah, our thought is that this would mostly apply to those areas that aren't currently developed. Vacant lots in or adjacent to neighborhoods. If someone was to, get a wild hair and buy up 10 residential lots in a neighborhood and decide they're going to take everything down and start over, they would still have to develop it as typical R1. They wouldn't be able to take advantage of this unless they could convince the township that, the redo district should apply to the properties they bought.
So I'll ask a follow-up question on that. It looks like the way it's written here is that it would be an option for the developer to choose to use these, this overlay district, requirements, or just stay with R1. Is that kind of what you're doing there?
Yeah, I don't think there was an intent to require all developments in this overlay to meet these standards, but certainly they could if they wanted to.
So I'll ask for just to see if the planning commission is agreeable to that itself, if they would expect, in order to promote density, if we would want to require the areas that we designate to meet this requirement, or if we want it to be an option. Does anyone have comments on that?
Of these parcels that you've located, how many of these would be R2 or R3? Or they're all R1?
These are all R1.
Are
There's
there-
not a single one of these that's, the only exception to that is number 10, the bottom portion of number 10, which is over on the east side of the highway. Bottom part of that is zoned RO, which is residential office, which does allow for a little higher density residential in that part of that property. But,
Do we have any R2 and R3 left in the township?
Todd can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe we have any vacant R2 or R3 properties. Maybe one at the top at Torrey Lane. I think there might be a little tiny property up there that's zoned R2 that's vacant, but that might be it.
Are we required, as more land comes available, to make R2 and R3 zoning?
Well, not necessarily, because you are part of a multi-municipal comprehensive plan, and really that higher density residential is being provided throughout the region and other locations. I think if someone came here to the township and tried a fair share challenge and said you're not providing for your portion of growth, it's clear that the region's planning together to accommodate that. So I don't think it would be an issue for the township.
Well, then, since we don't have any land for R2 and R3, that point you brought up about creating just one zoning district to allow this stuff is mute.
Well, I think it would simplify it if anybody wants to make changes to their property in the future. It's not to say redevelopment couldn't happen on an R2 or R3 property. There's certainly some here in the township where there's older structures. It's possible someone could come in and propose something new. And I think from our point of view, at least it would make the ordinance a little shorter and a little easier. There's one thing to refer to, and you don't have to have a mixture of regulations. Literally, they're almost, I think they're fairly close to one another. There's not much difference between the two at this point.
So, in that case, my point would be that I think we should allow it, but we should talk about the percentage that we want in the, we already do allow it. We already have it in multiple neighborhoods. We have it in your neighborhood, there's townhouses and apartment complexes. We have it in Tommy Saunders' neighborhood, he has multiple duplexes in that neighborhood. I'm not sure, don't travel up into Liberty Hill whether they have duplexes or not.
They do.
They do. And then on top of that, you have the grandmother apartment clause in your neighborhood, Amy, where there's got to be 10 places that have 650 square foot houses. I know the owners of some of them. So in a sense, you have duplexes everywhere within R1 communities. Anyhow, so we're really just catching up with the times with our zoning. I think we should just decide to go ahead with it and decide on the amount we want to have as a percentage of the land.
And then just to point out, I think both Springfield Commons and Liberty Hill are both PRDs, or planned residential developments. They're a little different where they came through and went through a different process to get approval to have, I think, some of those unit types up there, that mixture. This would make it a little less complicated, I think, for
For them
property
to
owners
do
to do
that,
that.
it would be less expensive to the builder to go ahead with something like that then, right?
And I've never been through the PRD review process, but I think they have to come forward and basically propose all of these things, whereas in this case, it's kind of laid out, here's what you can do without having to come forward and actually make a proposal to the township.
So Jeff, I'll ask you, if relative to this overlay district, would you be in favor of it being optional to the developer, or would you want to require them to meet the density requirements, that we actually have some kind of minimum density?
Optional.
Okay. Does anyone else have a comment on that? Okay.
Looks like
Oh, Chris
Chris
has
has
his
his
hand
hand
up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think optional makes sense to me, and also, Mark, at the top of your comment, you mentioned that the 10 acres was something that we could discuss. I like the 10 acres. I think it shows where we have some space to do this kind of overlay district, but that's just sort of a beginning look at that. So if we want to talk about that 10-acre thing, that would open up some, either keep it where it is or discuss options and open up maybe some other properties. I like 10 acres, but could be convinced if there's some logic to changing it.
I mean, while we're on that topic, I'd like to just bring up, if these properties on this map here, numbered 1 through 11, I know we've predominantly talked about properties numbered 10 and 11 was as being one of the main properties we would consider for this new district. Would anybody be in favor of some of these other numbered properties being also included in that district?
In the overlay district?
Yes. I mean, all of them or some of them?
some of them are definitely under 10 acres,
Yeah.
just so you're aware. I think number 9, number 7, number 6 in particular are all under 10.
Yeah, I think anything over 10 acres should be considered.
And number 5 is only a portion of it. That's the Bowl Mansion property.
I was gonna say, isn't that in the cultural zoning district?
It is, yeah, and I think we included it on this map just because it's a parcel with significant residential development potential, theoretically, because it is a large area, but the white portion of that property would need to be an acre minimum.
Okay.
So only a handful of these would be included in what we're talking about, that are 10 acres and over.
Right. Only a handful, right. Numbers 1 through 3, number 4, 5, and then 8, 10, and 11 would all be over 10 acres in size.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any concerns identifying specific tracks that are for an overlay as kind of a spot zoning, if you don't allow other?
You would have to actually identify the properties you want to include in the overlay. We couldn't have it just on the books and say it's open to anybody to use it. It would have to be, if it's a true overlay zone, it would have to be applied to certain properties. I don't think you need to have or there wouldn't be a concern about the spot zoning nature as long as you provide some rationale behind why these properties are being included, because you're not rezoning them, you're applying additional regulations to them, and I don't think it's viewed by the courts quite the same way as a true spot zoning. Because you're going through the planning process now of identifying why these properties should be included. There would be something written up to justify that moving forward to the board before they adopted anything.
Well, and I would comment that if we eliminate properties numbered 6, 7, and 9, that the remainder of them are relatively contiguous, or I mean, at least some proximity to each other. And I would suggest that we not consider 6, 7, and 9.
No, I think he's got 8.
Okay, I thought it was bigger for some reason.
It might even be 7, because he talked about the wildflower as a 5-acre experiment.
That could be.
Yeah.
We're talking about number 6, sorry.
It's kind of interesting, number 6, because it does back right up against the commercial district, which is a multi-use, you know, with apartments.
Which property?
6.
Bob Potter's.
Bob Potter's. Backs up against the village.
I mean, it's right,
It's R1 there, right next to it,
Yeah.
but it's a
On
small
one,
piece of,
on one side, yeah.
yeah, on one side, but none of his property falls within commercial, does it?
No, that's not commercial there.
That's R1 to the north of it. It's surrounded by R1 on 3 sides, and then I believe it's I think it's rural residential to the west. I think it's the is it the Hill House up there?
Yeah.
The Hill House? Yeah, I think that's zoned.
Is Chambers Alley isn't that the village?
The village is to the north of Chambers Alley, so yeah, everything to the south is R1.
Okay, so he touches R1.
He touches R1.
Okay.
And that property is 6.47.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought that was bigger.
So 10 acres does sound like a good number.
And it's pretty consistent with what you've done with the things in the rural zoning districts, right? So if people want to question it, it's just, it's consistent across the board.
So, should we talk specifically about the Ball property then too, whether it would be too complicated to include them or not?
I think it probably would, and that might be something that we need to add to the intent here of the district, because we were relying on the R1 density, you know, the single-family detached density to be defined in R1, where this would be an overlay. And essentially what it would do on the Bowl property would allow 1 acre detached lots and then really small multifamily lots, which might not really blend well together, to have really large and then much smaller. So it would be difficult to at least apply it to the, well, I think to the whole property would be difficult.
So is there a consensus that we should probably not consider the property labeled as number 5 then?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I also have I think 50% of total units is too high.
Are you talking about number 2?
Yes.
We've kind of gone back and forth on that, because he had a 25% drawing at one of our meetings. We didn't like that one. We wanted,
Yeah, we looked at 75.
But 50%
was
if you
what-
visualize the neighborhood.
Well, it's 50% of units, not
Units.
necessarily 50% of land.
Or 50% of the number of parcels, but it'll be quite a few duplexes.
I think that was the rendering that we had shared back in June that everyone seemed to be in favor of.
Yeah, you talked about 75%,
Back in the
50%, and 25%, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I remember the maps. I just trying to visualize.
Wasn't that for property
Like Gary
number 10?
McShay's property, about how many you would put on there.
Isn't that what?
Property
It
number
seems-
10?
Yeah, we looked
Yeah,
at
that
property
price.
10 and
Yeah.
11.
Yeah.
I think we used those combined.
Right. So, but we're now talking about property number 2? No?
No, I think
Okay.
he's saying in general.
In general, whether
general.
50% as
As the
the
number.
maximum is the right number, as opposed to something less than that.
So in math-wise, then it would be 25% of the land. To say available lots could be duplexes, because that would get you to 50% of the available space, right?
Right.
So that's what you're looking at visually
Yeah.
in the neighborhood.
Right.
And do you think that that's makes it to R2 in your mind, or does that make it enough R1 compared to R2?
My recollection of the sketches anyway was that that seemed to be reasonable, that more than that was,
Here, I'm
Became
gonna-
more R2.
yeah.
I'm gonna pull up the map. Mark's gonna send it to me,
Yeah.
and then I'll pull it up and share it.
You're relying on me being able to do all this very quickly.
No pressure.
No pressure. All right. Send it right in. I should have it in a second. And I will say this, what we did back in June, that rendering, did not have the same standards shown here, calculated out and figured out. We had streets shown on that plan that had 100% of units along a block face as multifamily or attached homes, because we hadn't come up with this. It was, I think, after the comments that were made back in June was when we were given direction to try to make sure they split up a little more throughout the development.
It's taken a while to get here.
Yeah,
I have it saved. I wonder.
And I'll just say personally, I think 50% would probably work for most of these properties, with maybe possibly the exception of property number 8. Just because of the size of that. Now, that one, it's just a yellow zoned R1,
right.
and I don't know what the rest of it is, what, ag?
Ag.
So that wouldn't apply then. Oh, okay. So when we draw the boundary,
Is it that one?
we would not
Yeah.
use the property boundary, this overlay boundary, we would follow the yellow line.
Right. Right.
Okay,
Yeah, we would just have it overlay just the R1 portion.
okay.
Okay, there we go.
So this was the sketch we had put together back in June, and again, we did not have these where 50% of the block face, because there at the bottom you can see there's a cul-de-sac or two that's primarily, multi or attached units at least. But we ended up with 86. I think we just did townhomes as part of this, so 3 or more side by side, and then 86 individual residential lots, and a lot of trees.
Stupid buffering.
Yeah, and that one looks okay to me.
It might be a little crowded.
In the trees? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Buffering is for reforestation plan.
Yeah.
We can refine the plantings.
What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, we need to put the trees more along the creek there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, are people on Zoom able to see the wall, the map on the wall right now?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, I'm still okay with 50%.
Yeah.
Any other comments on that? And you're still a little leery, Jeff?
I don't want it more than 50.
Ah, mhm.
I was hoping for a little bit less. I mean, I just toured the neighborhoods that have those duplexes.
Yeah, I
and
think
stuff in there.
we all agreed if it
And
got
I
over
took a
50, then we're
look.
talking about just rezoning the property to R2, if we were gonna do that.
Yeah, I
So,
just like the way some of the neighborhoods looked that didn't have quite as many duplexes in them.
mhm.
Yeah, but again, remember, those were developed as PRDs.
I know.
So it's a little different process.
I'm just looking at them, visualizing that we're gonna streamline the, effect, the ability for contractors to come in and take a look at a piece of property and say, oh, I can do this much, and in some cases, that's what they'll do to get the most value out of a piece of property. And so they're not gonna build less.
And that's some of the, well, and that's some of the intent to allow that
Right.
Yeah,
to happen.
which is what we were going for anyhow, to bring down some cost of some housing.
Yes, I don't know where you find that nice middle ground of 25, 50%. It's
I'm okay with 50,
You're fine.
if everybody else is going.
yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, it's fine.
I'll just make while we have that map on the wall, I'll just make a comment that I've said this before, I don't think it's necessary to have a buffer along an arterial road, but whatever works easiest as far as writing the regulations, I guess.
That's part of the discussion that the Shade Tree Commission is having. So just brief aside to all of this with the buffering, Mark was at their meeting this month to talk more about the buffering regulations. They're gonna come at the joint meeting and talk with you and the supervisors, because it's clear that the intent, I have to go back and look at the minutes. We don't know what the intent was when they wrote the corridor overlay district, but from the way it's applied, it's almost blocking the view of businesses and things from the road. And if that's the intent we want, then we have a ton of trees, and that's probably what we need. But I don't think that's the intent of the supervisors anymore. And the Shade Tree Commission has commented that a lot of these trees, they're getting put in by engineers, and nothing against engineers, but they're not landscape professionals. And I can tell you from the maintenance facility, if you look at our maintenance facility, we have clumps of trees, and we lost half the trees and had to get them replanted. And so there are a bunch of things they've identified, and I think they'd like to have a broader discussion with the Planning Commission and the board about what the view and vision for a buffering is. And if, like we were talking about, one of the guys in the Shade Tree Commission said, if we just cut the regulation in half, like the number of trees in half, that would be a good start. Because right now we require so many in the different yards and things that come into play. So that's a coming attraction for you guys, having that discussion in January, and then hoping seeing some, ordinance amendments back in the winter. We did have Scott Burke from Scott's Landscaping at our last meeting, and CJ Henry, who owns Green Horizon Landscaping, is on our Shade Tree Commission. So they're good resources because they understand the landscaping world better than the rest of us. So.
And I will say that under the landscaping requirements, what we started writing up without actually having tree requirements identified was these buffer areas will only be required where the overlay was adjacent to a different zoning, so something without the overlay. But if it's along a public street, that wouldn't count as adjacency, so we wouldn't have that along the arterial where we.
Well, yeah, we need an interpretation of that.
Right.
Where's the zoning boundary in the middle of the street?
Right.
So
this would, like, along the Willow, in this example, along Willowbrook, we'd require this 25-foot vegetated buffer yard. Whatever plantings you end up deciding are acceptable, but it wouldn't be required along street rights of way or anything like that unless you wanted to have something required there.
okay. So and the Shade Tree Commission has definitely got that on their work plan. They'll be making some.
Oh, they've been working on it. They've talked about the last 2 months, and then they want to have, and I have notes like that they've shared things that they've discussed, and they had a great meeting with Scott Burke. He was here this month, and they want to talk with you and the supervisors more in January because they want to understand. They're obviously the supervisors are the policymakers, but understand what the actual intent. And they asked me to go back and try to find when the corridor overlay was put in if there's any discussion about why there are so many trees required and what the actual overall intent is and how we can kind of, if that intent has changed, how we can match that with our regulations. They have a lot of concerns, not just the number of trees, but the species that we list. We'd like to get the species out of there and have them sit down and come up with a list of these are the approved understory trees, these are the approved canopy trees. And trees we have a species list for the township for the street trees that they update every year. Trees get diseases, trees are not good with salt, trees are not good with a lot of water, things that you would encounter in a buffer area. So trying to give, and that's what Scott Burke had said. Scott Burke had said if this could at all be, somehow regionalized so that everybody has the same regulation or everybody has the same list of trees as a start, that would be a big help. So they had, I think, Mark was at our last meeting, I think they had some very good discussion. They share the concerns, and they've been going through also your subdivision and land development ordinance to look at some of the tree species that are totally inappropriate that are in there from the 70s and some other things. So I think they share the concern about the number of trees, especially after we walked all 4 acres of our property with Scott Burke when we realized half those trees had died. And that's when we realized that really there was an issue with that buffering.
Okay. Yeah, and I would suggest, I mean, I think the borough has a very comprehensive list, and I think it changes too.
Yeah.
So I would even suggest that we consider just adopting theirs by reference.
I'm not sure we're going to want to do that. The borough has some trees that we don't necessarily, on their street tree list, that we don't necessarily agree with out here. It doesn't really work out here. We do have a lot of the same trees, but we do, I think we'll look at their list and see what it is, and then the Shade Tree Commission will make recommendations. We have a lot of deer issues out here that I'm not sure the borough has. A lot of our trees at the maintenance facility got decimated by the deer, so that's something we need to think about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, are you getting enough feedback, or does any other people want to make more comments about this?
I think we have sufficient feedback that we can move forward, at least looking at the next phase of this, if everyone's okay with the idea of looking at R2 and R3 about possibly consolidating those depending on what we find. And we can continue to refine this as well once we get some feedback on buffering and how we go about doing that.
All right. Does anybody have any more comments before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. Well, thanks, then. Now we have review of the township's sign ordinance. Amy or Mark, you want to?
I'll start this, and then Todd's on, and Todd's the sign guy, so Todd can fill in. So the Board of Supervisors asked us to look at the sign ordinance, and you'll remember the sign ordinance has been on your work plan for the last couple of years. So we pulled out the sign ordinance and found that it was originally adopted in 1969 and that there were some amendments made in 1996. Todd did a very comprehensive review, which we put in your agenda packet, and he's the one who administers the ordinance, so he knows it better than anybody. We also sent the ordinance to our solicitor because there have been a host of court cases and Supreme Court cases about content-based regulations, and we got back today, and I copied everybody's place, I emailed it out as well. We got back from the solicitor his review of the content-based regulations in the sign ordinance, and generally he says our authority to regulate signs is generally limited to location, size, lighting, characteristics, etc. So we have a lot of, after reviewing his memo and looking at what we have on the books now, we have a lot of work to do because our sign ordinance is really out of date. It regulates all manner of things that we can't regulate. So we're probably going to have to do, it's probably more than just some simple amendments, we're probably going to have to do a rewrite. The supervisors are concerned, and Supervisor Graham in particular brought this up. They're concerned about internally lit signs and illumination of signs. So I think that's also something, we do have our lighting ordinance, which we had done some work to a couple years ago, but I think that's also something we need to look at as well. There is an internally lit sign, there's probably more than one, but the one we're all aware of is on Atherton Street for the Wenken Financial Services, and we did get some complaints about that. So I'll let Todd, if there's anything he wants to bring up, and then I think what we need to do is start the conversation. I think the conversation with the supervisors, we have a very restrictive sign ordinance now. We don't allow signs in the right of way. So I think the conversation perhaps that needs to be had at the joint meeting with the supervisors, and perhaps you guys could think about this and provide some feedback between now and then, is do we want to continue to have a very restrictive sign ordinance, or do we want to open it up a little bit so that we do allow some signage in the right of way, or we do, I will say with political signs, technically they're not allowed in the right of way, but we don't remove political signs because they are First Amendment speech issues. So we don't want to get into that issue. College Township removes political signs. If they get to be too much in the right of way, their zoning officer goes out and removes them. I'm not sure we want to get into that. But Todd, is there anything else that I missed that you want to add?
Just dovetailing as to what you said, based upon the memo we got from our solicitor today, I think if we're going to have an ordinance that's not content-based, I think if the Board of Supervisors decides that no signs are going to be allowed in the right-of-way, which is what the regulations say today, we're not going to be able to say, well, political signs can, but others can't, because that would be a content-based determination there. So generally, I think that since, the regulations are as old as they are, I think the supervisors probably need to, in cooperation with the planning commission, decide if the philosophy that exists in the regulations now is still applicable in 2022 going into 2023. As Amy mentioned, I believe that our sign ordinance is probably the most stringent of any center region municipality. I haven't read Half Moon Township sign ordinance. I assume they have one, but I don't know. I have read College and Ferguson's over the last few years, and I've looked at Patton Townships, I believe. Haven't looked at the borough because that's not really an apples to apples comparison, I don't think. But my recollection of those regulations is they regulate an awful lot more than we do. I mean, the breadth of their ordinance is a lot more, but I think, without checking those ordinances again, I think they allow more signs per property. We only allow 5, except on a corner lot where you have an entrance onto more than one street, you're allowed a 6th sign that is a second pole sign. We only allow 1 full sign per property. The largest we allow any sign is 25 square feet to face, except in the village, and that's 15 square feet to face. And that's another distinction that we're probably going to have to get rid of in our ordinance according to our solicitor's memo. Mark and I talked about that a little bit this afternoon, and we may have to have a conversation with him about whether or not the historic designation in the village is sufficient reason to have additional regulation on sign size. I wonder if it is, and that's ultimately a decision for the legal professionals. So I think in addition to, recommending almost a complete rewrite of our sign ordinance, I think the planning commission needs to talk to the board of supervisors about discussing the philosophies that have been in place for 60 years and see if they're still the same. The internally lit sign thing, I honestly don't remember if we have more than one. I think we do. I think there's an internally lit sign out on 45 at the small engine shop. There may be a couple other ones somewhere else. My take on the conversations I've had and I've heard about those is it's just a personal preference thing. If somebody can demonstrate that there is actual light pollution from internally lit signs, I think that's a legitimate thing to discuss. The conversations I've had with people who design these signs and people who manufacture these signs is that the internally lit signs generally are, according to them, much easier to regulate for light pollution because the light sources themselves are encapsulated in some material, most often plastic, sometimes glass, and depending on what a zoning ordinance says, the wattages or the lumens can be adjusted to make sure an exterior light in a typical subdivision, how we make a developer quantify that is they have to show the anticipated lighting patterns based upon the manufacturer's specifications and some engineering data. We can make them do the same thing with internally lit signs. We can have them show what the relative brightness is, what the lighting pattern is, and make sure that the light does not travel off the property. So I think if we have conversations, and I anticipate we will, because we already have, if we have conversations about how we don't think that we should have internally lit signs, well, because they're ugly or because people don't like them, we don't regulate ugliness elsewhere in our zoning regulations, so I don't know that that's a great place to start. So that's basically where I think we are. I think we're at the very beginning of the conversations on these types of things, and I don't think we can get very far until we've recognized the fact officially that we have to totally rewrite our sign ordinance, and we have to have some serious conversations about the philosophy of how we want to regulate signs, going forward now. Go ahead, Chris, we lost the chairman.
Do you see a working meeting with the supervisors on this specifically?
Well, I think what Amy and I talked about earlier today is, if it's possible, the joint session that you have in January could at least partially be dedicated to discussing this issue. I wonder if, maybe at our next meeting, and I don't know if we're gonna have a December meeting of the Planning Commission, or if we're just gonna, skip that one and go to January, but if we do have a December meeting, perhaps what you might want to consider doing is, spending half an hour or so just discussing what give everybody a chance to fully review the regulations, have a conversation about what the philosophy seems to be, which is pretty strict, and see if that's how we want to proceed in the future. One of the things Mark and I talked about this afternoon is, we went to great lengths and we put in a lot of effort in making the commercial zoning district out here adjacent to Main Street reusable and more developable now. We spent all that time and did all those things in an effort to have redevelopment occur that would be beneficial. It seems counterintuitive to me to then say, yeah, but whenever new businesses locate there and spend the extra money, we're going to make you abide by 60-year-old sign regulations that don't really do a whole lot to promote the businesses that we're trying to attract into the new commercial zoning district. So, those are the types of things that have to be discussed. In the end, it doesn't matter to me what everybody decides, because I don't live here. That you folks do. So, but I don't say that flippantly either. It's just a matter of you guys in consultation with the Board of Supervisors decide how we do things, how we look at things, and I think you have to have some serious conversations about that.
Okay.
Bob has his hand up.
Are we getting complaints about the current ordinance aside from lighting? Are people coming in and saying the ordinance is too restrictive, we want to do this, this, and this, and we end up, or is it just kind of more of a philosophical perspective that we want to, we need to move?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. The sign ordinance is not something we use a lot. There has been basically about the same number of signs in the township for as long as I've worked here. A business goes out, a business comes in, they go through the process, they have their sign license. We don't create new commercial districts very often, if ever. We don't create new properties within commercial districts very often, if ever. So it's not like we're growing our commercial and industrial districts in those districts that typically have commercial signage. So it's sort of a static customer base, if you want to call it that, for signs. Now, it's not unusual whenever someone proposes a sign or is trying to get some information on what they can do as far as signs, to register some frustration with the fact that they can only have 5 signs on a huge property if they have one, and that the largest sign can be only 25 square feet in area. We hear that quite a bit. We very rarely honestly hear any complaints about sign lighting. I would say in the almost 29 years I've been here, it's less than one complaint a year, easily. And most of the complaints I hear about sign lighting, including from people who design and manufacture signs, are uplit signs and downlit signs. I don't think hardly anybody has ever expressed a great affinity for uplit signs, because you're shining light up into the sky. Downlit signs are probably more palatable to those people who are worried about light pollution, but there's still the problem of completely shielding the bulb so they can't be seen from anywhere off of the property. It certainly can be done, and with with LED lights becoming a lot more popular in the last 10 or 15 years, that makes it even more of a problem, because LEDs are actually way brighter than the incandescent lights, so it's sometimes even harder to shield the LED glare from off the property. So the complaints we get aren't really that. The complaints aren't, related to sign license application fees or the 3-year license fees, because they're very low. They're extremely low, I would guess, compared to everybody else in the center region. So there just aren't a lot of complaints about our sign regulations, except for the smallness of the maximum sign size and the small number of signs that are permitted for property.
So is it hurting anybody's business?
Well, I mean, that's one of those things that's hard to quantify. Like if you put in, something that I don't like next to my house, you're going to devalue my property. It's hard to quantify that. I think if someone comes in and decides they're going to put a lot of money into one or more properties, like I mentioned earlier, they're going to want to be able to advertise their business and their product to the fullest extent they can. So 5 small signs, potentially on an acre property, if you're the business owner, probably doesn't do that adequately. I would think that it doesn't do that adequately.
Okay, other questions for Todd? Yeah, I wanted to make just a few comments. I'm just browsing through it. Of course, I noticed the content type stuff because I was familiar with that from College Township being an issue. But on the licensing, you did have some question about there's a 3-year license for permanent signs. And you talked about whether or not that should be renewed. And I don't even see where your fees are. Is that in a whole different section of the ordinance?
It's in our fee schedule.
There's a schedule.
It's on the fee schedule that the board adopts every January.
Does this ordinance reference the fee schedule?
I don't remember if it does or
Yeah.
not.
If it doesn't, it should. And then, so and I'm fully in favor of having renewable licenses because that's the only way you can really keep up with any potential changes that might be coming on. So I do think that they should be renewed every 3 years. And so I'm in favor of that. For the number of signs, I mean, there's you have your ground signs, your pole signs, your ground signs, your projecting, but then a wall sign to me is kind of different, and I could see that area being based upon the size of the building, like possibly the gross floor area or something to that effect. And that would allow, especially some commercial businesses to have, more signage if they were using wall signs. Doesn't necessarily get into the number of ground-mounted signs that they would have, but that's just one issue, one way we could, have a little bit more flexibility for that, while still putting some type of regulation on it. I guess the only other thing I was browsing through it when you had the definition of a wall sign. I remember an issue was a parapet wall, which I don't think we have too much of those here, but there was a lot of those I remember in college. And these are walls that basically extend above the roof line. And I know you mentioned here that a sign is not to extend above the roof, but I think maybe that's something you need to consider for buildings where they specifically put a parapet wall above the roof, primarily for the intention of putting a sign on it. I mean, we haven't had that much big of an issue in Harris Township about that.
You mean like a bowl on top of a building?
Well, that's not a wall, but yes. Is that a flag or what is that?
It's a bull.
It's a bull.
It's a bull. You new here or what?
Yeah. He's that bull's on the National Register. For artistic. He's like a super important piece of art.
I want to know how many square feet it is.
Sean Kelly could probably tell you, because he had to pay a pretty penny to get it restored when he bought Kelly's.
Right. And I fully agree with Todd about the right-of-way. I do not think, other than, government-mounted signs, that there should be any other signs out in the right-of-way. And every sign that's, whether it be a political sign or a commercial sign or just somebody's personal sign, I think it should be placed on a private property with the permission of the property owner in some facet.
I agree.
Yeah.
Other than you have to go back and do a lot more work on this, is there anything else you want to talk about on this tonight?
I don't think on this tonight. I think one of the conversation pieces that we'll want to have before you guys meet with the board is kind of your feelings on this. Do you think it should be, right now it's pretty restrictive in terms of the number of signs and where they can be. Do you think the ordinance should stay restrictive? Do you think the ordinance should be a little less restrictive? And we'll start looking at, we can do a little bit deeper dive into this ordinance and start pulling out some of the content things. And I think Todd did a good job of kind of hitting on some of the things that we still need to go back and maybe ask the solicitor about. Certainly with the village is always different because it's historic and what we can and cannot regulate within the village under these new regulations from the court cases or whatever. So I think if there's anything else tonight you want to talk about, that's great. If not, I think your next meeting, being in December or January, you should have a little bit more of a conversation piece about this so that when we go and have the joint meeting, you can talk with the supervisors about it a little more.
Okay. Any other, as far as I'm concerned, again, I think allowing some flexibility with wall signs is okay. I think I still like the idea of being somewhat restrictive with, signs that are mounted out on the property line.
Chris has his hand up.
Chris?
I would just say that because we've had this on our work plan for a while, and we have a joint meeting with the supervisors every January. Is that right, Amy?
Yep.
I know we may not be ready to, advance a conversation by January. We certainly won't be ready if we don't meet next month. So unless there's a really compelling reason to not meet next month, to me, it makes sense to, focus on this and maybe any other business that we need to at a December meeting so that we can be ready to, be efficient with time moving into 2023.
I just don't want you to start down a path and do a lot of work on something and then have them say at the meeting, because obviously they're the policymakers, have them say, oh no, we want to be way less restrictive and let's allow signs everywhere. I don't think they're going to say that, by the way, but
agreed.
I don't want you to start down that path. And also, Todd and I talked today, we need to identify some ordinances. College's ordinance and Ferguson's ordinance we've looked at, but maybe look for some other ordinances. I was going to reach out to my colleagues across the state to try to figure out where we want to go with addressing some of these things. We can certainly, I'm not saying we can't start working on it, we certainly can. I just don't think you need to get all the way down the path before you talk with the supervisors.
Agreed. But we as the planning commission do need to have a conversation so that we're in, if not full agreement, at least sort of working in the same direction before we would do anything more.
Does it make sense to have a more exploratory conversation with the supervisors?
Yeah, I think so.
So just sort of a preliminary conversation to identify that we are on the same page or we are not?
Yes, I think that is key, because I don't think the supervisors, because obviously we just got this information from the solicitor today, so they don't know that we have to basically rewrite the entire ordinance. One of the supervisors kept saying to me, it's not a big deal, just change the eternally lit, don't allow eternally lit signs, that's all you have to do. And I'm like, well, if we're going to open up the whole ordinance, we're going to open up the whole ordinance, right? It makes sense to do this. So I don't think they understand it's as big of a lift, and I think having a conversation with them so everybody's on the same page would be super helpful before we get too far down the path. And we can start, like I said, Todd and I can start pulling other ordinances and some language and things and see what we can find that we, like that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Chris, does that suit you?
Yeah, whether that happens at a January meeting or we can get a supervisor or two to come to a December meeting of the planning commission, I don't think that's critical. I definitely agree with the point of having more basic philosophical conversations with them before moving a lot further.
Okay. I'll just jump around a little bit more. I know that one of the comments Todd had in his list was about temporary signs. It didn't seem like there was a limit on the time, a time limit for the number of renewable times. Does that sound correct, Todd? You can renew it?
Well,
as
yeah, I
often
think
as you
there's
want?
a limit on how long you can have temporary signs up.
You can have
but I
it for
don't
90
know.
days, but then you can renew it.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I would say on top of that, there should be some maximum on renewals if it's a temporary sign, or like in your comment, you say it just becomes a permanent sign.
yeah, I agree. I actually think 90 days is too long for a temporary sign in most cases, and I think there should be a limit of 1 or 2 renewals or something like that.
Okay, other comments? So, we may or may not discuss this next month.
Yeah, we'll see if you guys are gonna meet, and we'll figure out what we can get done between now and then.
Okay. All right, well, if there's no other comments, then I guess we'll move on to the agenda for December.
Todd, do you know of any plans that we have coming for December?
Not that we know of. I think the only plan we're currently reviewing isn't one that the planning commission would review anyhow, so I don't think we'll have any plans.
Okay. So if you want to meet in December, and your meeting is the week of Christmas, so I will put that out there. If you want to meet, if you want to meet in December, we can certainly do that, and we can look at the sign ordinance, and you can do your nominating committee. You could also wait. Your meeting in January gets moved, so it's the second Monday of the month, so you have a little bit of time. So that would be the 8th or 9th. I think it's the 9th of January. And you could just meet it's January 9th. You could just meet January 9th, do your chairman and vice chairman, do your work plan, and then we could just maybe focus on the sign ordinance there, getting ready for your discussion with the supervisors at the joint meeting on the 25th of January. It's totally up to you.
So the joint meeting, you say, is the 25th, and our meeting would be the 17th?
No, your meeting would be the 9th.
Or the 9th, okay.
It gets moved.
Because of the holiday?
Yes, it gets moved around because of MLK Day.
Amy, how does the work plan conversation roll forward? Do we discuss it 1 month and adopt it in another month, or is it brought up, discussed, and in one meeting?
Yeah, so typically what we do is you guys discuss it in January, and we prepare an itemized list of what you've done in 2022, and then we talk about what should go on in 2023, and you guys suggest it, and then I put it together, send it out, make sure you're okay with it, and then you present it to the board on the 25th. Jeff's making faces at me.
Sounds good.
I think that works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay.
that works.
So we likely would not have a meeting next month then?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's totally up to you, but I would say unless something comes up that you need to act on, maybe let's not meet. That gives Todd and I a little bit more time to pull some sign ordinances and some regulations. And then I don't think your work plan discussion never really takes a long time on your agenda, so I think we could have a good amount of time on discussion and kind of prepare a list of maybe bullet points and questions for the supervisors on the 25th. And, you know, the supervisors, I think, when we do this kind of stuff in the past, we've always had like a PowerPoint for them. And we could actually, we could put together after your meeting a PowerPoint that you guys could review and present to them and maybe have a more productive conversation. Because I don't want to see, again, like you guys to do a ton of work and then the supervisors go, no, that's not what we want to do. So I think we can start down the path, identify what needs to come out, and then you guys can talk more about what you want to ask them, what, you know, kind of the conversation you want to have. The number of signs, the location of signs, that's all important stuff. Yes, Jeff?
I don't understand and I should, I know how to wire houses, but when they talk about backlighting a sign, you know, the illume that it gives off can be set to a degree. And I think that's a discussion point if we go with those type of signs about how lit that we're going to allow them to become. And I won't know what that number is, and none of us probably at this table, that would be acceptable. You know what I mean? Without a meter to go out, but you can make them awful ugly if you light them up too bright, and you can make them pleasantly just glow. And I think we're looking for pleasantly just glow.
Well, and I think that's also where I've looked at Ferguson's ordinance, and they have a pretty lengthy discussion piece on illumination. Like they have a big lengthy set of regulations. So I think that's where we need to look at Ferguson's, we need to look at College Township, because those are things we can go visit, right?
Right,
We can
it's
drive
the-
around and say, oh, no, I really hate it. It's very bright in Ferguson Township. I'm making that up. But we can look at it and then come back and say, that's really kind of what we want. So, yeah, we, like I said, we have to pull. I've seen Ferguson's, their ordinances are like 20 pages long. I don't know that we want a 20-page long sign ordinance, but we need to look at some of these other ordinances and see what we can do.
Okay. All right, we'll talk about that likely in January then. If there's no other comments, we can move on to the reports then. Anything to be, under zoning permits, anything being handed out tonight?
No, I don't have anything.
Yeah, I actually did the report today, but I never got around to copying what I needed to copy, so you'll see that at the next meeting.
Okay. Center Region Planning Commission. Chris, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I will comment to say that I appreciate Kent helping out when I can't be here, and I was unable to go to the CRPC meeting earlier in the month, and so Bob Igo went as the alternate. And so, Bob, do you have a report on CRPC for us?
I have a brief report, but I may toss some of it over to Mark. But a large portion of the meeting went to review of the College Township sidewalk and pedestrian master plan. So that's a pretty interesting plan that they have there, and they're looking at, it's a guide for, their future projects and guidance on, intermunicipality or the community connectivity within the township, looking at, for the pedestrians. They're concerned about safety, connectivity, and accessibility. And so it's part of their facilities master plan, right? So, talked a little bit about preparing for the comprehensive plan. I don't know if, Mark, you want to talk about that. And their red cap plan, which is, they're looking at regional capacity, development capacity. And they're talking about sewer capacity, they talked about redevelopment, interesting comments on redevelopment and capacity, sewer capacity. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mark.
Just that's something that we use the data to help inform the residential discussion that we've been working on for some time. And so we're updating that regional development capacity report. It'll be the third iteration of it. So we're going to go back and look at how things have changed over the last 10 years since it was first done in 2012. And as Bob mentioned, we're going to be looking at things like how did redevelopment impact our growth forecast. We had a lot of units added through that, as well as how did some municipal decisions to rezone land inside the boundary help increase the capacity in places like Patton Crossing in Patton Township. Added a lot of units up there. Same with, I think, over in College Township where the old mobile home park was. Clearly a lot of units being built to help redevelop that area. So they're just trying to look at some other aspects of how development within the growth boundary has been going over the last decade.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting report. The redevelopment, I think, is significant. I don't know how significant, but it is having an impact on what's going on. And it will probably increase the amount of available land for additional development.
Right.
So it's an interesting study that's coming out soon. Well, they're working on it.
Okay. Thanks, Bob and Mark. The CCMPO Technical Committee, I know George Harrigan provided a relatively substantial report to us. I don't know, is there anything we should mention tonight?
I don't think so. I think the only thing on maybe the connector project, because he talked about that in his report, the supervisors, Chairman Lord and I met with Senator Langerholtz, who's the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, to discuss our concerns with the design of the road. And Senator Langerholtz indicated that he's going to get us a meeting. He asked us in the meeting, it was great. He said, who's the highest level at PennDOT that you've met with? And we said, well, the district executive. And he said, well, that's unacceptable. So he's going to try to get us a meeting with the current Secretary of Transportation and then with the new Secretary of Transportation after Governor Shapiro takes over. So we're making some inroads, and Patton Township has invited myself and I think Vice Chairman Hardin's going to go with me to their meeting in December to present our concerns with the road, because we're trying to get some support we're asking PennDOT to really reconsider the design of that road.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So some positive movement there.
Good.
Okay, Spring Creek Watershed Commission.
Yeah, there were two meetings. The first meeting that we had, the one we had in October, was a working group meeting. We had about 15 people show up for that, and that's the group that's trying to take the phase 2 plan and phase 2 report and make it actionable. So we're working towards development of committees and subgroups, so that when we move into 2023, we actually have an action plan developed. And then we met on the 16th, and that was a major discussion on the governance of the Watershed Commission. There's been a lot of, over the years, since COVID, really we've lost some institutional knowledge with people who have been on the commission for some time and gone off. Had a situation where we've had elected officials, where we need elected officials to represent the townships or the municipalities, and we need some of those folks on the commission. And how we manage the bylaws, because the bylaws are kind of restrictive. So we're dealing with governance issues on the Watershed Commission, but I think that we're moving forward. We have election new officers in January. So.
All right, thanks, Bob. Recent actions by the Board of Supervisors.
So the official map is moving forward. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the subcommittee and also with that project. The supervisors reviewed the official map draft at their meeting last week. We had some residents come who discussed concerns with pedestrian safety on West Main Street. So they asked that a pedestrian pathway be added to West Main Street to address those concerns, which we're doing. We have to prepare an ordinance, and then this will go to CRPC and the adjacent municipalities for a 45-day comment period. So it will likely be adopted in February at their meeting.
Okay.
And then the next thing I think you're going to see at some point, Mr. Songer came and spoke with the board about the plans for Hawk Ridge Phase 2, which if you remember you saw at your meeting last month. Somehow the plans morphed between last month and this month and became almost rezoning request to make it R1 because there isn't any R1, and he wants to put solar units on top of houses, and he wants sewer, and I'm not sure, it was an 1.5 hour long sales pitch type of thing. At the end of the day, Mr. Songer has to decide if he wants to do what he needs to do to apply for a DRI. Some of the supervisors said they were inclined to at least consider it. Bud Graham, Supervisor Graham, is pretty against it and questioned Mr. Songer on some of the things, and questioned that this was going to open up sewer further up the hill, because he had asked he had the greenway land that he had showed on his plan. He asked that also be included in the sewer request, which really kind of tipped Bud off that maybe this wasn't a great idea, because he was afraid that that's opening the door. We've gotten a lot of feedback from residents on Academy Street since then. We've gotten a ton of emails over the weekend from them. They're obviously concerned. So assuming he's going to come back with we told him he needs to make formal requests for all these things. Assuming he's going to come back and do that, I'm not sure. Supervisor Graham, one of the things he asked for was that Mr. Songer show options of like what happens if he gets sewer, what happens if he doesn't get sewer, what happens if he rezones, because he'd like to look at all the options before, which I think is right, before making a decision. Tom didn't seem inclined to want to spend the money to do that. Those were his words. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but it was, if you have an hour and a half of your time and you'd like to watch the meeting, you could watch that section of the meeting, and his whole thing just morphed from when you guys saw him.
Mm-hmm.
And he had this huge memo, and I was reading the memo before the packet, and it's like, well, if you rezone this, and I'm like, no, that's a formal process. The DRI is a formal process. And he was told, like, their supervisors can't tell you, yes, we're going to give you sewer Monday night, because that's a formal process that goes through the planning commission before it goes to the center region. So, yeah, yes.
We don't get the choice on whether he gets sewer or not. The sewer authority does, doesn't it?
No, so sewer is a regional process in the center region. So what happens is, and Mark can explain probably better than I, but he has to come to the township, and the township as the host municipality has to vet it and decide if they're going to support it. And if they support it, then he submits a development of regional impact application to the center region, which gets reviewed for completeness, comes back here, one more time for approval, goes back up to the center region planning commission for review, then goes to the general forum. The general forum grants sewer, but it has to be 5, it's a super majority, 5 of the 6 municipalities have to agree to the request. And I don't know, and this was sort of the conversation we had with Supervisor Graham in my office on Friday, I don't know that College, Ferguson, and Patton, who have ridges, are going to be really keen on opening up the crux of his argument is he can't perk on any of the land up there, so he needs sewer because he can't perk. So if that's why they give him sewer, then if there's someone on Mount Nittany that can't perk, College Township's going to be in the same boat, and they're setting a legal precedent then that opens up the ridge everywhere, not just in Harris Township. That's the flip side of this request, right, is that it's not just here, it opens up everything. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Does that make sense?
Well, we can say that we don't want it to have sewer and that it goes nowhere.
Right.
The supervisors can say that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I
You
think,
can say it, but it won't
We
mean
could
that.
recommend it to the
Right.
supervisors if we
Right.
wanted to.
You can recommend it.
right, and then, well, the thing is the way it's set up now is the regional growth boundary and the sewer service area are contiguous, one and the same. So I think that's the key. I mean, obviously, the sewer authority is the one that's providing the service, but the municipalities and center region decide where that boundary is. And there's been discussions about relaxing it a little bit here and there for certain reasons, but personally, I don't think we should relax it for a new development. You know, I can see relaxing it for an individual parcel that's having issues, but I don't think we should relax the growth boundary unless it goes through that whole DRI process.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
So. Okay, well, it sounds, sorry I missed that one.
Sounds like fun.
If you have an hour and a half to spend,
Listening to Tom.
maybe have an adult beverage in your hand.
So, okay, is there anything else for the good of the order tonight?
Move to adjourn.
Okay, we've got a motion to adjourn the meeting, a second on that?
Second.
Okay, a motion is second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, meeting
All right.
adjourned. Thank you all.